The winter of 1920 settled over the Montana mountains like a heavy quilt, muffling sound and softening edges until the world seemed wrapped in cotton. Inside the small log cabin perched on the hillside, Jake Mitchell sat in his worn leather chair, gnarled hands wrapped around a steaming cup of black coffee. At 78, his hair had turned silver as creek ice, and his face bore the deep lines carved by decades of prairie wind and desert sun. But his eyes, pale blue as winter sky, remained sharp as the day he'd first strapped on a gun belt. Across the room, his grandson Billy worked at repairing a saddle, the 16-year-old's hands moving with the careful precision Jake had taught him. The boy had come to live with his grandfather after his father died in the Great War, carrying wounds deeper than those visible on the surface. Jake understood such wounds. He'd carried his own for most of his life. Billy, Jake said, his voice carrying the gravelly warmth of seasoned timber. Do you believe that sometimes God places angels on the path of sinful men? The boy looked up, all pausing in his work. What do you mean, Grandpa Jake? Jake set down his cup and leaned back, his gaze drifting to the frost-covered window where the peaks of the Rockies rose like cathedral spires against the pewter sky. I'm going to tell you about your grandmother, about how a nun saved the soul of a gunslinger, and how that gunslinger learned the true meaning of courage. Billy's eyes widened. Jake rarely spoke of the past, and never of his late wife beyond gentle mentions of her kindness. The old man's voice took on the cadence of memory, each word chosen with the care of a man who understood the weight stories could carry. This happened 42 years ago in the winter of 1878. I was 36 then, and I was not a good man. Anger lived in my chest like a coal that never cooled, and I carried death on my hip like other men carried pocket watches. The cabin seemed to grow quieter, as if the very walls leaned in to listen. Deadwood, Dakota Territory, December 17, 1878. The blizzard struck the Black Hills with the fury of divine wrath, turning the world into a whirling chaos of white. Jake Mitchell rode through it like a specter of vengeance, his black coat whipping around him, ice forming in his dark hair where it escaped his hat. His horse, a black Mustang he'd named Vengeance, picked its way carefully through the deepening drifts, its breath steaming like dragon's fire in the bitter air. Jake's right hand rested easy near the Colt's single-action army holstered low on his thigh. The weapon was more than steel and wood to him. It was an extension of his will, engraved with the names of his wife, Mary, and daughter Sarah in flowing script along the barrel. 12 men had died by that gun in the 3 years since his family's murder. 12 men, but not the one who mattered most. 3 days earlier, Martha Henderson had stood on the porch of her ranch house, her weathered face creased with worry as she watched him prepare to leave. Jake, she'd said, her voice carrying the authority of a woman who'd buried one husband and raised a dozen cowboys, hatred will consume your soul if you don't let it go. Mary wouldn't want this for you. But Jake couldn't let it go. How could he explain that every night he closed his eyes, he heard his daughter's final cry? How could he make anyone understand that the sound of his wife's voice calling his name as flames consumed their home played in his mind like a broken music box? The man responsible rode free while Jake's family lay cold in the ground. That was a mathematics that demanded correction. 3 years of hunting had led him here, to this frozen wasteland, following whispers and rumors like a wolf following a blood trail. Detective Dan McGillicuddy, a hard-faced Irishman from Chicago, had found him 2 weeks prior with news that made Jake's blood sing with anticipation. Morrison's planning something big in Deadwood, McGillicuddy had said, his breath visible in the cold air of Martha's barn. My sources say it's personal to him. Special merchandise, they're calling it. Something worth more than gold. St. Mary's Convent, same evening. Sister Evangeline Rose knelt before the altar in the small stone chapel, candlelight dancing across the golden crucifix that dominated the far wall. At 24, she possessed the kind of beauty that poets might call ethereal, though it was largely hidden beneath the black habit and white wimple of her order. Her hands, clasped in prayer, bore the calluses of honest work, and her brown eyes held depths that spoke of sorrows faced and overcome. The convent nestled in a protected valley like a jewel in cupped hands, its gray stone walls and peaked roofs dusted with snow. 15 nuns called it home, women who had chosen to dedicate their lives to God's service through teaching, healing, and charity. To the outside world, Sister Evangeline was simply another of these devoted souls. Only Mother Superior Catherine knew the truth about the young woman's past. 6 years earlier, she had been Evelyn Hawthorne, daughter of Dakota Territory's governor, a girl groomed for political marriage and social prominence. The night before her wedding to Vincent Caldwell, she had cut her hair with kitchen shears, donned her brother's clothes, and walked 50 miles through dangerous country to reach the convent's doors. Mother Catherine had taken one look at the desperate young woman and offered sanctuary without question. Now, as Evelyn prepared for her final vows that would bind her permanently to religious life, she felt the peace that had eluded her in her former existence. Teaching Apache children to read, tending the sick, cultivating the herb garden that provided medicines for the surrounding communities. These simple acts had given her purpose beyond the gilded cage of her birth. But peace, she had learned, was a fragile thing. Earlier that evening, Tommy Young Eagle, a 17-year-old of mixed Apache and Irish blood, had arrived at the convent with a letter that made Evelyn's hands tremble as she read it. The expensive paper bore the Caldwell family seal, and the handwriting was achingly familiar. My dearest Evelyn, 6 years of playing at being a nun has gone on long enough. You know you cannot hide from me forever. I have found you at last, and our marriage contract remains legal and binding under territorial law. You will return to fulfill your duties as my wife, by choice or by force. You have 48 hours to prepare yourself. If you do not come willingly, I will retrieve you myself. I care nothing for who might be hurt in the process. Your devoted husband, Vincent Caldwell. The letter fell from Evelyn's nerveless fingers as the chapel seemed to spin around her. Vincent had found her. After 6 years of blessed silence, the nightmare of her past had returned. Caldwell Ranch, same night Vincent Caldwell paced before the massive stone fireplace in his study, his reflection multiplied in the tall windows that looked out over his family's vast holdings. At 28, he had grown from the spoiled youth who had terrorized servants and assaulted maids into something far more dangerous. A man of wealth and position who believed the world owed him whatever he desired. The room reeked of expensive tobacco and aged whiskey, and 5 hard-faced men sat around the heavy oak table, their weapons visible and well-maintained. Vincent had chosen each man carefully for the task ahead. Gentlemen, Vincent said, his voice carrying the cultured accent of Eastern education, the mission is simple. We retrieve my wife from her hiding place among the nuns. If the sisters cooperate, no one need be harmed. If they resist, he let the threat hang in the air like smoke. Snake Eyes Rodriguez, a Mexican gunfighter with a reputation for cruelty, leaned back in his chair. What about the law, senor? Kidnapping a nun might bring unwanted attention. Vincent's smile was cold as winter moonlight. There will be no kidnapping charge. Evelyn Hawthorne signed a marriage contract when she was 16. Under territorial law, that contract remains valid regardless of where she chose to hide. I am simply reclaiming my lawful wife. The legal technicality was solid, Vincent knew. His father's lawyers had ensured the contract's language was ironclad, anticipating potential complications. Even if Evelyn had taken religious vows, they were temporary vows, not the permanent ones that might complicate matters. But Vincent's plans extended beyond simply retrieving his runaway bride. His gambling had left him deeply in debt to the most dangerous man in the territory, and Gentleman Morrison had made it clear how that debt would be paid. Morrison's private office, Deadwood Morrison's office, occupied the entire second floor above the Bella Union Saloon, furnished with luxuries imported from San Francisco and beyond. The man himself sat behind a massive mahogany desk, dressed in a perfectly tailored suit that could have graced the finest establishments in Chicago or New York. His silver hair was pomaded to perfection, and his soft hands bore rings worth more than most men earned in a lifetime. Those who made the mistake of judging Morrison by his refined appearance rarely lived to repeat the error. Behind the cultured facade lurked a mind of calculating cruelty, a man who had built an empire on others' suffering and called it business. Vincent, my boy, Morrison said, his voice carrying the honey-smooth tones of a born predator, I trust you understand the terms of our arrangement. Vincent shifted uncomfortably in his chair. I'll bring you Evelyn, but after you've broken her in, she returns to me as agreed. Morrison's smile never reached his eyes. Of course, though I must say 6 years in a convent should have preserved her quite nicely. My clients in San Francisco pay premium prices for educated women with spirits still intact. The words sent ice through Vincent's veins, but he'd passed the point where moral considerations mattered. $50,000 in gambling debts was a death sentence unless paid, and Morrison had made it clear that Evelyn was the only currency he would accept. "She's a governor's daughter," Vincent said weakly. "If she disappears—" "Oh, she won't disappear," Morrison interrupted, his tone remaining conversational. "She'll simply choose to leave her religious life behind and travel west with her loving husband. These things happen. Young women sometimes find religious devotion less appealing than conjugal bliss." Morrison rose and walked to the window overlooking Deadwood's main street, where snow fell steadily past the yellow glow of gaslights. "I've built quite an operation, Vincent. A pipeline of fresh merchandise flowing from here to Denver, Cheyenne, San Francisco. Young women who disappear from failed homesteads, Indian raids, family tragedies. The West is a dangerous place. Accidents happen." "You're talking about white slavery," Vincent said, the words barely audible. "I'm talking about business," Morrison replied sharply. "Supply and demand. I provide a service and I'm compensated accordingly. Your wife will be just another transaction, albeit a particularly valuable one." Vincent's hands shook as he reached for his whiskey glass. He'd known Vincent was ruthless, but the casual way the man discussed trafficking women like cattle made his stomach churn. Still, the alternative was his own death, and Vincent Caldwell was fundamentally a coward. "When do we move?" he asked. On the trail to Deadwood, Jake had been riding for 2 days when the blizzard caught him, transforming familiar landmarks into alien shapes of white and shadow. His Mustang picked its way carefully along what he hoped was still the main trail, ice crystals forming on its muzzle with each breath. The Winchester rifle in its saddle scabbard was loaded and ready, 44 cartridges in the magazine and 1 in the chamber. His Colt held 6 rounds of .45 caliber death, with 30 more cartridges in his gun belt. Enough firepower to kill Morrison and whoever stood with him, if Jake lived long enough to use it. But as he rode deeper into the storm, memories plagued him like hungry ghosts. Mary's voice, gentle and patient, teaching their daughter Sarah her letters. The sound of Sarah's laughter echoing through their small house. The way Mary's eyes lit up when she looked at him, as if she saw something good in a man who'd killed 7 men before their wedding day. Martha Henderson's words echoed in his mind. "Mary wouldn't want this for you." Maybe not, but Mary was dead, and the dead didn't get to choose how the living honored them. Jake had been a different man once. He'd worked his small claim in the Black Hills, raising cattle and horses, building something clean with his hands instead of destroying with his guns. Mary had made him believe he could be more than the sum of his violent past, that love could redeem even a man stained with blood. Morrison had taken all of that, burned it to ash and scattered it on the wind. The storm began to ease as darkness fell, and Jake found shelter in a grove of pine trees that offered some protection from the wind. As he unsaddled his horse and built a small fire, he allowed himself to think about the morning. Morrison would be expecting to conduct his business in private, probably at some isolated location where screams couldn't be heard. Jake would be waiting. St. Mary's Convent, 11:47 p.m. Evelyn knelt before the altar, her rosary beads sliding through her fingers as she whispered the familiar prayers that had sustained her through 6 years of religious life. The chapel was her refuge, the one place where the world's cruelty couldn't touch her. Candles flickered in their holders, casting dancing shadows on the stone walls, and the golden crucifix seemed to glow with inner light. "Hail Mary, full of grace," she murmured. "The Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women." The prayers had always brought her peace, but tonight they felt different, desperate, as if she were trying to build a wall of holy words between herself and the approaching darkness. The chapel door burst open with such violence that one of the ancient hinges cracked. Tommy Young Eagle stumbled inside, his young face twisted with fear and urgency. "Sister," he gasped, struggling for breath. "Men with guns. They surround the convent." Evelyn's heart hammered against her ribs as she rose from her knees. Through the chapel's single window, she could see dark shapes moving between the buildings, their breath visible in the frigid air. "How many?" she asked, proud that her voice remained steady. "6, maybe more. The leader, he calls for you by name." Before Evelyn could respond, Mother Catherine appeared in the doorway, her gray hair hastily covered, her lined face grave with concern. At 55, the Mother Superior had faced down drunken cowboys, territorial officials, and Apache war parties with equal composure. But tonight, fear flickered in her dark eyes. "Evelyn," she said quietly, "you must go to the hidden cellar. We'll tell them you're not here." "No," the word came out harder than Evelyn intended. "I won't let innocent sisters suffer for my troubles. This is my burden to bear." Through the walls, Vincent's voice cut through the night like a blade. "Evelyn, I know you're in there. Come out now and no one gets hurt." The threat implicit in his tone made Evelyn's skin crawl, but she'd spent 6 years preparing for this moment in her prayers. She'd always known it might come. Mother Catherine moved to block the chapel door. "Child, you don't have to face this alone." "Yes, I do." Evelyn touched the silver crucifix at her throat, drawing strength from its familiar weight. "This is God's test for me. I won't fail it." She walked to the front entrance of the convent, Mother Catherine close behind her. Vincent stood in the courtyard with his hired men, their weapons visible and ready. Snow continued to fall, dusting their shoulders and hat brims with white. Vincent had changed in 6 years. The boy she'd known had grown into something harder, his handsome features twisted by cruelty and entitlement. His expensive clothes couldn't disguise the predator underneath. "Hello, wife," he said, his smile cold as the winter air. "It's time to come home." "I am home," Evelyn replied, her voice carrying across the courtyard with surprising strength. "This is where God called me to be." "God can wait," Vincent said, pulling legal papers from his coat. "This marriage contract says otherwise. Signed and sealed when you were 16, perfectly legal under territorial law. You belong to me, Evelyn. You always have." Mother Catherine stepped forward, her small frame seeming to grow larger as righteous anger filled her. "This is holy ground, Mr. Caldwell. You have no authority here." "I have every authority." "Stay authority," Vincent replied, his patience wearing thin. "Evelyn took temporary vows, not permanent ones. Our marriage contract predates any religious commitment she might have made. The law is on my side." He gestured to his men, and they moved forward with practiced efficiency. "You can come quietly, or we can drag you out. Your choice." Evelyn looked back at the chapel where candlelight still flickered through the windows. 6 years of peace, of purpose, of belonging to something greater than herself. It was ending, but she could choose how. "I'll come," she said quietly, "but leave the sisters alone. They've done nothing wrong." "Of course," Vincent said, his relief obvious. "I'm not unreasonable." As rough hands bound her wrists behind her back, Evelyn whispered one last prayer. "Virgin Mary, I entrust my soul to your protection. If this be my trial, give me strength to endure." Rapid Creek, 2 miles from the convent. The ancient oak stood alone beside the frozen creek like a sentinel from another age, its gnarled branches reaching toward the star-filled sky. Vincent's men had chosen the location carefully, isolated enough that screams wouldn't carry, but accessible enough for Morrison's purposes. They bound Evelyn to the massive trunk with practiced efficiency, her arms stretched above her head and secured to a heavy branch 8 feet from the ground. Additional ropes around her waist held her tight against the rough bark, while more bonds at her ankles forced her legs apart and anchored them to iron stakes, driven deep into the frozen earth. The position was designed for humiliation as much as restraint, leaving her defenseless and exposed despite the heavy habit that still covered her body. Every muscle in her shoulders and hips screamed with strain, and the bitter wind cut through the wool like it was paper. Vincent stepped close enough that she could smell the whiskey on his breath and see the cruel satisfaction in his eyes. 6 years of playing at holiness, Evelyn. Did you really think it would last forever? Evelyn turned her face away, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing her fear. "Morrison will be here at dawn," Vincent continued, his voice dropping to an intimate whisper. "He has specific plans for you. Plans that will break that stubborn spirit of yours. After he's finished, you'll be grateful to return to me." "God sees what you do, Vincent," Evelyn said, her voice steady despite the cold that made her whole body shake. "He will judge." Vincent backhanded her, the blow snapping her head to the side. "Your God abandoned you the moment you ran from me. If he cared, he would have protected you." God's protection comes in many forms, Evelyn replied, tasting blood from her split lip, sometimes through suffering, sometimes through unexpected saviors. Vincent laughed harshly. There are no saviors coming, wife. Just you, me, and a very patient businessman who's going to teach you the price of defiance. He mounted his horse, his men following suit. Dawn, Evelyn. Use the night to pray for strength. You're going to need it. The sound of hooves faded into the distance, leaving Evelyn alone with the wind and the watching stars. The ropes bit into her wrists, and the cold seeped through her habit like icy fingers. But she began to recite the psalms she'd memorized during her years at the convent. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. Her voice grew weaker as the hours passed, but she didn't stop praying. If this was her Gethsemane, she would face it as her Savior had faced his, with faith, courage, and trust in a plan greater than her understanding. In the distance, a wolf howled, its voice carrying across the frozen landscape like a herald of the dawn to come. Jake's camp, 1.5 miles from Rapid Creek. Jake made his camp in a sheltered grove where the wind couldn't reach, building a small fire that would provide warmth without giving away his position. Tomorrow, Morrison would come to collect his merchandise, and Jake would be waiting with 3 years of accumulated rage and 44 rounds of Winchester justice. His weapons lay beside him, cleaned and ready, the Colt with its familiar weight and deadly precision, the rifle that had never failed him in a dozen gunfights, the Bowie knife that could kill silently if needed. Everything he needed to end Morrison's reign of terror and finally lay his family's ghost to rest. But as midnight approached, something made him restless. A sound on the wind, faint and rhythmic, like music played too far away to identify. He listened carefully, his years as a gunfighter having taught him to trust his instincts, even when logic said danger was unlikely. There it was again, not music but human voice, speaking in a language he recognized from childhood memories of his Irish Catholic mother. Latin. Someone was praying in Latin in the middle of nowhere. Jake checked his weapons and followed the sound through the snow-covered pines. The voice grew clearer as he moved, a woman's voice, weak with cold but steady with determination. The prayers his mother had taught him at her knee, words that had brought comfort to a frightened boy in a world too often cruel. He crept closer, using skills learned in a dozen ambushes, until he could see the source of the praying. A figure bound to a massive oak tree, black habit stark against white snow, silver crucifix gleaming in the moonlight. Jake's breath caught in his chest. Morrison's special merchandise was a nun. For a moment he was 12 years old again, kneeling beside his dying mother as she whispered the same prayers now coming from the bound woman's lips. His mother's voice. Jake, the strongest men are those who protect the innocent, especially women and children. Promise me you'll always be one of the strong ones. He'd broken that promise many times in the years since, but tonight offered a chance for redemption he'd never expected. The woman looked up as he stepped into the moonlight, her eyes wide with terror. "Sister, please don't do that," she whispered, her voice cracking with exhaustion and fear. "Please don't hurt me like the others." Jake stopped, his heart breaking at the fear in her voice. She thought he was one of Morrison's men, come to begin whatever torture they had planned. "Sister," he said gently, raising his hands to show they were empty, "I'm not here to hurt you. My name is Jake Mitchell, and I'm going to get you down from that tree." The nun stared at him, searching his face in the pale light. I don't know you. How did you find me here?" "I don't know," Jake answered honestly. "Maybe God led me here." The words surprised him. He hadn't spoken of God with anything but bitterness for 3 years, but looking at this woman, seeing the faith that kept her praying even in her darkest hour, something stirred in his chest that he thought Morrison had killed forever. He drew his knife and began cutting at her bonds, working carefully to avoid injury. As the ropes parted, she collapsed forward, and he caught her against his chest, feeling how cold and weak she'd become. "Can you stand, sister?" I think so." Jake removed his long coat and wrapped it around her shoulders, the thick wool still warm from his body. She pulled it close, shivering violently as circulation returned to her limbs. "Sister, who did this to you?" "A man named Vincent Caldwell. He claims I'm his wife, but I never married him. I'm a bride of Christ." Jake's jaw tightened with familiar anger. But it was different now. Not the cold fury that had driven him for 3 years, but the protective rage of a man seeing innocence threatened. Where is this Vincent now? Gone. He said someone named Morrison is coming at dawn to take me away. The world stopped spinning. Morrison? Gentleman Morrison? You know him? He killed my family 3 years ago. I've been hunting him ever since. Ma'am. The nun studied his face with new understanding. You're not here by accident, are you? You came here for him. Yes. Jake met her eyes, seeing compassion there instead of judgment. I came here to kill him. And now? Jake looked at this woman who'd kept her faith through torture, who'd prayed for strength instead of cursing her enemies, who showed courage he wasn't sure he possessed. Morrison would come at dawn, but the mathematics of vengeance had suddenly become more complicated. Now I don't know, he said honestly, but I know I won't let him hurt you. As if summoned by his words, the sound of approaching horses echoed through the night air. Morrison was coming early, and Jake had to choose. The revenge he'd lived for, or the redemption he'd never dared hope for. The nun's eyes met his in the moonlight. What's your name? Jake. Jake Mitchell. I'm Sister Evangeline Rose. And Jake? She squeezed his hand with surprising strength. Whatever happens next, God brought us together for a reason. The hoofbeats grew closer, and Jake checked his weapons one final time. Whatever that reason was, he would face it with courage worthy of the woman beside him. Dawn was still hours away, but Jake Mitchell's long night of reckoning had begun. The sound of approaching hooves shattered the crystalline silence of the winter morning like gunfire through cathedral glass. Jake's hand instinctively moved to his Colt as he counted the riders emerging from the tree line, their breath steaming in the frigid air like the exhalations of demons materializing from hell itself. 6 men, moving with the careful precision of predators who had done this dance of death before. Get behind that fallen log, Jake whispered to Sister Evangeline, his voice tight with controlled tension that came from years of living on the knife's edge between life and death. Whatever happens, stay down and don't move until I tell you. But even as he spoke, Jake recognized the futility of their situation with the cold clarity of a man who had survived too many impossible odds to harbor illusions. Morrison had arrived with overwhelming force, and Jake was caught in the open with a woman to protect and nowhere to run. The mathematics of violence were simple and unforgiving. 6 guns against 1, with an innocent caught in the crossfire. The lead rider pulled up 30 yards away, and Jake's blood turned to ice water in his veins. Even after 3 years of hunting, seeing Morrison in the flesh sent a shock of recognition through him, like lightning striking twice in the same place. Time collapsed, and suddenly he was standing in the smoking ruins of his home again, holding his daughter's lifeless body while his wife's blood soaked into the earth. Gentleman Morrison sat his magnificent bay gelding with the easy confidence of a man accustomed to getting his way through superior firepower and absolute ruthlessness. His expensive overcoat was pristine despite the journey through snow and wilderness, cut from cloth that cost more than most men earned in a year. His silver hair gleamed beneath a beaver felt hat that represented someone's month of wages, and his soft hands bore rings worth more than the average homestead. But it was his eyes that Jake remembered most clearly from 3 years of nightmares. Pale gray and utterly without mercy, they held the casual indifference of a man who viewed other human beings as nothing more than obstacles to profit or tools to be used and discarded. Jake Mitchell, Morrison said, his cultured voice carrying easily across the distance with the honey-smooth tones of educated evil. I wondered when our paths would cross again, though I confess I didn't expect to find you playing knight-errant to a wayward nun. How delightfully romantic. Jake stepped forward, placing himself between Morrison and Sister Evangeline, with the protective instincts that had been hammered into him by his Irish mother's teachings about defending the innocent. His hand remained steady near his weapon, though every instinct screamed at him to draw and fire. Morrison's men had spread out in a loose semicircle with weapons ready and expressions that suggested they would enjoy the violence to come. Morrison, he said, his voice carrying the weight of 3 years' worth of accumulated hatred, refined and concentrated into pure essence of vengeance. I've been looking for you for a long time. Oh, I know, Morrison replied with genuine amusement that made Jake's skin crawl with revulsion. You've been quite persistent, actually. Quite the dedicated avenger. 12 of my associates dead, several profitable operations disrupted, numerous business arrangements complicated by your interference. You've cost me a considerable sum of money, Mr. Mitchell. I really should be angry. The casual tone, the complete absence of remorse, or even acknowledgement of the lives he'd destroyed, sent rage surging through Jake's veins like molten metal. His vision began to narrow, red creeping in at the edges as the beast of vengeance that lived in his chest strained against the chains of tactical thinking. You killed my family, Jake said, each word falling like stones into still water, creating ripples that would spread outward into violence and blood. Yes, I did, Morrison said with the same inflection he might have used to comment on the weather or the quality of his morning coffee. Business necessities, you understand. Nothing personal, merely practical considerations in a complex commercial enterprise. Sister Evangeline gasped behind him, and Jake felt her hand touch his back through his coat, a gesture of comfort and solidarity that somehow steadied him when he wanted nothing more than to empty his gun into Morrison's chest and watch the light fade from those cold gray eyes. The mine wasn't worth killing a woman and child, Jake said through gritted teeth, fighting to maintain control over the fury that threatened to consume his reason. Morrison laughed, the sound echoing off the surrounding trees like the caw of a carrion crow celebrating fresh death. The mine? Oh, my dear Mr. Mitchell, you've spent 3 years pursuing me over a fundamental misunderstanding. The mine was worthless, a played-out claim that wouldn't have paid for the powder to blast it. Your wife died for something far more valuable than silver ore. The words hit Jake like physical blows, each revelation striking him with the force of a sledgehammer to the chest. 3 years of hunting, 12 men dead by his hand, countless nights spent planning revenge, and it had all been based on a lie he'd told himself because the truth was too horrible to contemplate. What are you talking about? Jake demanded, though part of him already knew he didn't want to hear the answer. Morrison's smile widened, revealing teeth that were perfectly white and somehow predatory. 3 years ago, your lovely Mary rode into the Black Hills looking for you. Unfortunately for everyone involved, she came across one of my transport operations. A wagon train of young women being relocated to new accommodations in Denver and San Francisco, where they would serve the recreational needs of gentlemen with refined tastes and substantial financial resources. Jake's world tilted on its axis. You're talking about white slavery. I prefer to think of it as providing employment opportunities for women who might otherwise find themselves destitute, Morrison said with mock piety. The West is a harsh place, Mr. Mitchell. Young women need protection, guidance, someone to ensure they don't fall into genuine degradation. I provide that service, and I'm compensated accordingly for my humanitarian efforts. And the euphemisms were obscene, made worse by Morrison's cultured delivery and apparent sincerity. Jake had known the man was evil, but this casual discussion of human trafficking as a business venture revealed depths of depravity that even 3 years of hatred hadn't prepared him for. Your wife was quite the moralist, Mitchell, Morrison said with casual cruelty. When she witnessed my operation, she became quite agitated, said she was going to report what she'd seen to the territorial authorities, spoke of justice and righteousness and other impractical concepts. So you murdered her? I gave her a choice, Morrison said with a philosophical shrug that suggested he viewed the decision as perfectly reasonable. Forget what she'd seen, continue her happy life with you and your charming daughter, and everyone could proceed peacefully with their respective endeavors. Or force me to take more permanent measures to protect my business interests and the livelihoods of my associates. And she refused. Oh yes, quite dramatically actually. Called me a monster, threatened to see me hanged, spoke of divine justice and eternal punishment. Such passion, such misguided nobility. Morrison's expression grew thoughtful, almost nostalgic. She was quite beautiful when she was angry, your Mary. I can see why you loved her so deeply. The casual admission of child murder hung in the air like a physical presence, poisoning the very atmosphere with its implications. Jake's hand trembled as he fought the urge to draw his weapon and die gloriously in a hail of gunfire, taking Morrison with him into whatever hell awaited them both. Your daughter, unfortunately, witnessed her mother's death. Morrison continued with the same detached tone he might use to discuss crop failures or weather patterns. Such a sweet child, but I couldn't risk loose ends. You understand the business considerations involved. Sister Evangeline's sharp intake of breath behind him reminded Jake that he wasn't alone in this confrontation, that his choices would determine not just his own fate, but that of an innocent woman who had already suffered enough at the hands of evil men. You're wondering why I'm telling you this, Morrison observed, studying Jake's face with the interest of a naturalist examining an interesting specimen. Why I don't simply have my men shoot you down like a rabid two and be done with this tiresome pursuit once and for all. Jake remained silent, though his mind raced through possibilities, all of them ending with him and Sister Evangeline dead in the snow, while Morrison rode away to continue his monstrous business. The truth is, Mr. Mitchell, that you've caused me considerable trouble over these past 3 years, but you've also demonstrated remarkable persistence, tactical skill, and a certain creative flair in your methods of revenge. I find myself in need of someone with your particular talents, someone who understands that sometimes unpleasant necessities must be accepted in service of larger goals. Go to hell, Jake said quietly. Perhaps eventually, Morrison replied with apparent good humor. But first, I have a proposition that might interest a practical man. You see, the sister behind you represents a significant business opportunity, possibly the most valuable acquisition I've encountered in years of careful cultivation. Jake felt Sister Evangeline stiffen behind him, her hand pressing more firmly against his back as Morrison's intentions became clear. She's under my protection, Jake said, his voice carrying the flat certainty of a man prepared to die for his convictions. Is she? Morrison glanced meaningfully at his men, who had spread out in a loose semicircle with weapons ready and the relaxed confidence of professionals who had done this work many times before. I count 6 guns against 1, Mr. Mitchell. Poor odds, even for a man of your considerable reputation. Before Jake could respond, another voice cut through the morning air like a blade through silk. Make that 8 guns, Morrison, but not the way you think. Everyone turned toward the voice with the sharp attention of predators suddenly realizing they might have become prey. Vincent Caldwell rode out of the trees with his hired men flanking him, but something fundamental had changed in the man's demeanor. Gone was the arrogant confidence of inherited wealth and social position, replaced by something that looked almost like genuine moral struggle. Vincent appeared to have aged years in the few hours since the confrontation at the convent. His expensive clothes were wrinkled and stained, his hair disheveled, and his handsome face bore the haunted expression of a man who had stared into the abyss of his own soul and found it wanting. Vincent, my boy, Morrison said with false warmth that didn't quite conceal his annoyance at this unexpected complication. The criminal remained mounted, but his earlier composure had shifted subtly. Where confidence had been absolute before, now calculation flickered behind his facade as he assessed this new variable in his carefully orchestrated plan. Right on time for our business transaction, though I notice you brought additional firepower. Surely you don't think that's necessary for such a simple matter. Vincent's horse pranced nervously as its rider struggled with some internal conflict that played out across his features like a war between angels and demons. Morrison, I've been thinking about our arrangement during the ride here. Maybe we can work out different terms for my debt. Different terms? Morrison's voice dropped several degrees in temperature, and his men shifted slightly in their saddles, hands moving closer to their weapons. You owe me $50,000, Vincent. The sister represents full payment of that debt, with interest included for the inconvenience you've caused me. There are no different terms. Jake watched this exchange with growing understanding of the forces at work. This wasn't just about retrieving a runaway wife or satisfying Morrison's criminal enterprise. Vincent was trapped in a web of debt to the territory's most dangerous man, and Sister Evangeline was the currency being used to settle accounts that had nothing to do with love or marriage, and everything to do with survival and greed. Vincent, Sister Evangeline said, stepping out from behind Jake despite his gesture for her to remain hidden. Her voice carried the clear authority of 6 years spent in service to something greater than herself, and her presence seemed to fill the clearing with a dignity that made the surrounding violence feel smaller and more sordid. Is this what you've become? A man who sells women to satisfy gambling debts? Vincent flinched as if she'd struck him across the face with a riding crop. The question hit him where his remaining conscience lived, in whatever corner of his soul hadn't been completely corrupted by wealth, privilege, and self-indulgence. "Evelyn," he said, her real name falling from his lips like a prayer or a curse. "You don't understand the situation. Morrison will kill me if I don't pay what I owe. It's not just about money anymore. It's about survival. So instead you condemn me to something worse than death?" Her voice carried the moral authority of someone who had chosen service over comfort, sacrifice over safety. The Vincent I knew was weak and selfish, yes, but not evil. Not this kind of evil. What happened to the boy who used to quote poetry and talk about honor? "People change, sister," Morrison interjected smoothly, his cultured voice cutting through the moment of human connection like a sword through silk. "Vincent has learned the harsh realities of the world, just as you're about to learn them. Idealism is a luxury that few can afford for very long." Vincent's hands trembled on his reins as Morrison's words sank in. 6 years of obsessing over Evelyn. And for what? To hand her over to this monster? The boy who had once quoted poetry to her? Who had dreamed of being worthy of her love? Where had that Vincent gone? His face cycled through shame, anger, and finally something he hadn't felt in years. Moral clarity. The debt, the threats, his own cowardice. None of it mattered compared to what he was about to become complicit in. "No," he said quietly, the word tasting like redemption on his tongue. Then louder, finding strength in the choice. "No, this isn't who I want to be." "I'm afraid it's rather late for such considerations," Morrison replied with cold amusement. "Debts must be paid, Vincent. Surely your expensive education taught you that basic principle of commerce." Jake stepped forward, his decision crystallizing with the sudden clarity that came in moments of absolute crisis. 3 years of hunting Morrison had led to this frozen clearing, but revenge suddenly seemed less important than the woman standing behind him with the quiet courage blazing in her brown eyes like candles in a cathedral. "Morrison," he said, his voice carrying the deadly calm that had preceded 12 gunfights and would now precede the 13th. "You want her? You go through me. And this time, I'm not interested in taking you alive." Morrison sighed theatrically, like a patient teacher dealing with a particularly slow student. "Mitchell, you'd die for a woman you met hours ago? Even a beautiful, educated woman like her is hardly worth throwing your life away." "I've been ready to die for 3 years," Jake replied with the simple honesty of a man who had nothing left to lose and everything to gain. "The only question was whether my death would accomplish anything worthwhile. Now I know it will." "And you think saving one nun justifies throwing your life away in a gesture of meaningless heroism?" Jake thought of his mother's gentle voice teaching him prayers in their small cabin, of Mary's faith that had seen good in a man stained with blood and violence, of Sister Evangeline's courage in the face of torture and degradation. Sometimes the most important battles are fought for just one person. Sometimes that's enough. Morrison's patience was clearly wearing thin, and his urbane mask began to slip, revealing the predator beneath. "Enough philosophy and romantic nonsense. Rodriguez, take the woman. Kill Mitchell if he interferes, but try to keep it quick. I have other appointments today." Snake Eyes. Rodriguez spurred his horse forward, his hand dropping to his gun with the fluid motion of a professional killer who had ended more lives than he could remember. But before he could complete his draw, Vincent Caldwell's voice cracked like a whip across the clearing. "No, I won't let you do this." Every eye turned to Vincent, who sat his horse between Rodriguez and his intended targets. His face was pale but determined, and his hand rested on his own weapon with the uncertain grip of a man who rarely used violence to solve his problems. "Vincent," Morrison said with dangerous quiet, his voice taking on the silken quality that preceded the kind of violence that left no survivors. "Step aside, now." "I won't let you turn Evelyn into a whore," Vincent said, his voice shaking but resolute. "I wanted her back because I loved the memory of who she was, who I thought I could be with her. But this," he gestured toward Morrison, "this isn't love. It's possession. It's evil. I wanted her back, yes. I've spent 6 years obsessing over her, dreaming about her, but not for this, not to feed her to your machine of degradation and suffering." "Then how do you propose to settle your considerable debt?" Morrison's hand moved toward his own weapon with the casual confidence of a man who had killed many times and expected to kill again. Your ranch isn't worth half what you owe me, and I'm not accepting promissory notes or good intentions. I'll find another way, Vincent said desperately. Well, everything, mortgage the family holdings, work for wages if I have to. But I won't be party to this kind of evil anymore. Morrison studied Vincent for a long moment with the calculating gaze of a predator evaluating prey, then nodded slowly with the kind of smile that made Jake's skin crawl. I see a crisis of conscience at the most inconvenient possible moment. How tediously predictable. He turned to his men, and his voice carried the flat authority of absolute command. Kill them all. The nun dies last, and make it slow. I want her to understand the full price of defying me and the cost of inspiring such misguided chivalry in weak men. The clearing erupted into chaos as 6 different men reached for their weapons simultaneously, and the winter morning exploded into violence that would leave the snow red and the silence permanently broken. Jake's Colt cleared leather with practiced speed. His first shot dropped Rodriguez before the gunman could draw, the heavy bullet punching through his chest with lethal precision. Rodriguez pitched backward out of his saddle, his unfired weapon spinning away into the snow as his life leaked out through the hole in his chest. 1 threat eliminated, but 5 remained, and Jake was already moving, rolling sideways behind a snow-covered boulder as the clearing exploded into the kind of violence that left no survivors and no easy answers. Sister Evangeline dove behind the fallen log as bullets flew. Even amid the chaos of gunfire and screaming horses, she whispered prayers, anchoring herself to faith while violence erupted around her. Vincent's men opened fire on Morrison's riders with the desperate fury of men who knew they were fighting for their lives against impossible odds. The temporary alliance was born of desperation rather than trust, but it created enough confusion to prevent Morrison's superior numbers from immediately overwhelming Jake's position. Jake rolled behind granite cover as bullets sparked off stone. His tactical mind raced through options, 6 guns against 1 with dwindling ammunition. Sister, he called over the symphony of gunfire that echoed through the forest like the opening notes of Hell's own orchestra. Can you reach my rifle? The Winchester had fallen from his saddle when his Mustang bolted at the first shot, spooked by the sudden violence into the kind of panic that had saved many a cowboy's life by removing him from immediate danger. The weapon lay 20 feet away, across open ground, swept by crossing lines of fire from Morrison's positioned men. Sister Evangeline looked toward the weapon with the calculating gaze of someone who had learned to make life-and-death decisions quickly and accurately. 20 feet might as well have been 20 miles with bullets cutting through the air like deadly hail, but she could see that Jake needed the rifle's greater range and power to have any chance against Morrison's superior numbers. It's too far. It's too... she called back, ducking as a bullet splintered the log inches from her head. Jake fired twice at Morrison's position, more to keep the criminal's head down than with any real hope of scoring a decisive hit at that range with a handgun. His tactical situation was deteriorating rapidly, with ammunition running low and no realistic chance of fighting his way out of the trap Morrison had set. Then Vincent Caldwell did something that surprised everyone in the clearing, possibly including himself. For the first time in his privileged life, he chose someone else's welfare over his own immediate safety. Evelyn! Vincent spurred his horse directly toward Morrison's position, his own men following in a ragged charge that drew the criminal's attention away from Jake's defensive position. Get to the rifle! Run! Morrison's gun boomed like thunder rolling across the mountains, and Vincent pitched sideways from his saddle as blood blossomed across his expensive coat like a deadly flower. But his sacrifice had opened a corridor of opportunity that Jake was quick to exploit, and his tactical mind immediately recognized the gift he'd been given. Sister, now, move! Sister Evangeline sprinted toward the Winchester with her black habit flying behind her like raven's wings, her feet finding purchase on the snow-covered ground with the sure grace of someone who had spent years walking mountain paths in all weather. Bullets kicked up snow around her feet like deadly fountains, but somehow she reached the weapon and threw it toward Jake's position with strength born of desperation and determination. Jake caught the rifle and immediately put it to work with the mechanical precision of a man for whom weapons had become tools of survival rather than instruments of aggression. The Winchester's greater range and stopping power began to tell immediately, forcing Morrison's men to seek better cover and disrupting their coordinated fire. But the odds remained heavily stacked against them. Jake counted 4 of Morrison's men still in the fight, plus Morrison himself, against Jake, in whatever fight Vincent's wounded men might still have left in them. Mathematics that didn't favor survival, but Jake had beaten worse odds before through superior tactics and sheer determination. Mitchell! Morrison's cultured voice carried clearly over the diminishing gunfire as both sides sought better positions. You cannot win this engagement. The mathematics are against you. Surrender the woman and I'll let you ride away with your life intact. Jake's response was a rifle bullet that splintered the tree trunk inches from Morrison's head, sending bark flying and making it clear that negotiation was not currently under consideration. I'll take that as a definitive negative, Morrison called back with genuine amusement that somehow made his evil seem even more pronounced. Pity. I could have used a man with your particular combination of skills and moral flexibility. The battle settled into a deadly game of cat and mouse, with each side seeking tactical advantage through movement, superior position, and conservation of ammunition. Jake's supply was beginning to run dangerously low, and he suspected Morrison knew it from long experience with this kind of wilderness warfare. Sister Evangeline crawled closer to Jake's position, keeping low as bullets continued to crack overhead with the sound of death looking for a target. Her face was streaked with dirt and tears, but her eyes still held the unshakable faith that had sustained her through 6 years of religious life and would sustain her through whatever trials lay ahead. Mr. Mitchell, she said quietly, her voice somehow audible despite the ongoing gunfire, I want you to know, whatever happens next, I'm grateful for what you've tried to do. No one has ever fought for me before. No one has ever risked their life to protect mine. We're not finished yet, sister, Jake replied, checking his remaining ammunition with the automatic precision of a professional gunfighter. 6 rounds in the Winchester, 3 in his Colt. Not enough to win a prolonged engagement, but maybe enough to buy time for something unexpected to change the equation. Yes, we are, she said with the calm acceptance of someone who had made peace with her fate and found strength in surrender to God's will. You've done more than enough, more than anyone had the right to ask or expect. Jake looked at her pale face, streaked with dirt and tears but still beautiful in the gray morning light, still radiating the kind of inner strength that had drawn him to risk everything for a woman he barely knew. Sister, when I start shooting, run for those trees. Don't look back. Don't stop. Just run until you find help. I won't leave you to die alone, she said with quiet firmness that brooked no argument. You will, because that's what I need you to do, Jake replied, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had commanded others in desperate situations and knew how to make hard decisions in impossible circumstances. Someone needs to survive this to tell the world what Morrison really is, to make sure those other women get justice, to see that his whole operation gets shut down permanently. Sister Evangeline stared at him for a long moment, her brown eyes searching his face as if memorizing every detail. Finally, she nodded reluctantly. What about you? I'll be right behind you, Jake lied with the practiced ease of a man who had learned that sometimes kindness required deception. He was preparing to begin his covering fire when an unexpected sound froze everyone in the clearing. The thundering of many hooves approaching fast from the direction of Deadwood, growing louder with each passing second. Morrison's head snapped up, and for the first time since Jake had known him, the criminal looked genuinely concerned about something beyond his immediate control. The riders who burst from the tree line wore the blue uniforms of the United States Army, their Spencer carbines at the ready, and their faces grim with the purposeful determination of men who had come to restore order to chaos. At their head rode a tall officer with a major's insignia and the weathered face of someone who had spent years dealing with the territory's worst elements. 12 soldiers in all, enough to tip the balance of power decisively in favor of justice and law all over criminal enterprise and personal vengeance. Their horses were lathered from hard riding, and their equipment showed the wear of men who had been in the field for days rather than weeks of garrison duty. Nobody move! Nobody! The major commanded, his voice carrying the absolute authority of federal law backed by disciplined firepower. This area is under military jurisdiction by order of the territorial government. Morrison's face went through a remarkable series of expressions in the space of seconds, cycling through surprise, calculation, anger, and finally settling on the urbane charm that had served him well in dealing with territorial officials who could be bought, intimidated, or otherwise neutralized. "Major Patterson," Morrison said with apparent delight, his tone shifting to the practiced charm of a man accustomed to manipulating those in authority. "How absolutely wonderful to see you again, though I'm afraid you've arrived at a rather inopportune moment. A simple business dispute that seems to have gotten somewhat out of hand." Major Patterson's gaze swept the clearing with the systematic attention of a military professional, taking in the bodies scattered across the blood-stained snow, the defensive positions held by the survivors, and the general atmosphere of barely controlled violence that hung over the scene like smoke from a funeral pyre. "Mr. Morrison," the major said with the kind of tone that suggested their previous encounters had not been entirely cordial, "I might have known you'd be involved in whatever this situation represents. You seem to have a remarkable talent for being present whenever violence and suffering occur in this territory." "A simple misunderstanding between civilized men," Morrison replied smoothly, his hands clearly visible and away from any weapons. "Mr. Vincent Caldwell was attempting to retrieve his lawful wife from an unauthorized religious sanctuary, and this gunman interfered with the legal process. I was merely providing assistance to prevent further bloodshed and ensure that territorial law was properly observed." Jake started to object, but Sister Evangeline stepped forward before he could speak, her torn and stained habit somehow still carrying an aura of dignity and moral authority that commanded immediate attention. "Major," she said, her voice clear and strong despite everything she had endured, "that man is lying with the practiced skill of someone who has made deception into an art form. I am Sister Evangeline Rose of St. Mary's Convent. I have never been married to Vincent Caldwell or anyone else. These men kidnapped me from holy ground and intended to transport me for immoral purposes." Major Patterson studied her carefully with the assessing gaze of someone accustomed to separating truth from fabrication in difficult circumstances. Her obvious sincerity, combined with the evidence of violence surrounding them, began to paint a picture that differed significantly from Morrison's sanitized version of events. "And you are?" the major asked Jake, his tone neutral but alert. "Jake Mitchell," Jake replied, keeping his hands visible and away from his weapons, despite every instinct screaming at him to remain ready for treachery. "I found Sister Evangeline tied to a tree. Morrison and his men were planning to transport her against her will for criminal purposes." "Completely absurd accusations," Morrison interjected with just the right mixture of wounded dignity and reasonable concern. "The woman is clearly suffering from hysteria brought on by the trauma of recent events. Mr. Caldwell can provide full documentation of their marriage contract, properly signed and witnessed according to territorial law." "Mr. Caldwell appears to be in no condition to provide anything at the moment," Major Patterson observed dryly, glancing at Vincent's motionless form sprawled in the crimson snow. Morrison's composure cracked slightly for the first time, a hairline fracture in his perfect facade. A tragic accident resulting from Mr. Mitchell's reckless gunplay and complete disregard for proper legal procedures. "Major Patterson," Sister Evangeline interrupted, her voice carrying the clear authority of complete honesty, "there is a priest in Deadwood named Father O'Malley who can verify my identity and my religious status. Mother Catherine at St. Mary's Convent can provide further documentation of my legitimate presence there. I am not married, have never been married, and these men committed kidnapping with intent to engage in human trafficking." The major considered this information with the methodical thoroughness of a man trained to gather facts before making decisions that could determine who lived and who died. The weight of federal authority settled over the clearing like a blanket, changing the fundamental dynamics of the situation. "Sergeant Williams," he said without taking his eyes off Morrison, "place Mr. Morrison under military detention pending a full investigation into these allegations. Corporal Jackson, attend to the wounded and secure this area as a crime scene." Morrison's carefully maintained facade finally cracked completely, revealing the predator underneath. "You have no legal authority here, Patterson. This is a civil matter between private citizens. The territorial government will hear about this federal overreach. Human trafficking across territorial lines makes it a federal matter under the jurisdiction of military law." Major Patterson replied with the calm precision of someone who knew exactly what authority he possessed and how to use it. And coincidentally, we've been investigating reports of missing women in this region for several months. Your name has come up repeatedly in our inquiries, Mr. Morrison. Jake watched Morrison's face cycle through rage, calculation, and finally the desperate resolve of a cornered predator. The criminal's hand moved almost imperceptibly toward his concealed weapon, and Jake knew with the cold certainty of experience that Morrison would rather die fighting than face a federal courtroom. "Sister, get down!" Jake shouted, bringing up his rifle as Morrison's gun cleared its hiding place with the speed of a professional killer who had survived this long by never accepting defeat gracefully. The clearing exploded into its final act of violence as Morrison's shot went wide, spoiled by Jake's bullet catching him in the shoulder and spinning him around like a broken marionette. But the criminal was far from finished, rolling behind his fallen horse and returning fire with the deadly precision that had made him so dangerous for so many years. The Army troopers spread out with professional efficiency, their carbines crackling like fireworks as they engaged Morrison's remaining men. But Morrison himself seemed to bear a charmed life, his bullets finding their marks while somehow avoiding the concentrated return fire that splintered wood and kicked up snow all around his improvised fortress. Jake worked his way closer with the patient stalking skills of a man who had learned that victory often went to whoever was willing to take the greatest calculated risks. This had become intensely personal again, not just about protecting Sister Evangeline, but about finishing something that had started 3 years ago with the murder of his family. "Morrison," Jake called out when he'd closed to within 30 yards of the criminal's position. "It's over. You're outnumbered and outgunned. Surrender and face justice." Morrison's laughter carried clearly over the gunfire, tinged with the hysteria of a man who had built his life on the suffering of others and now faced the reckoning he'd always known would come eventually. "Never, Mitchell. If I'm going down, I'm taking as many of you with me as possible." The criminal rose from cover with both guns blazing in a final gesture of defiant violence, his face twisted with the fury of a man who had lost everything he'd spent years building. Jake felt the wind from a bullet that passed so close to his head it singed his hair, but his own aim was steady and true, guided by 3 years of practice and an unshakable determination to see justice done. The Winchester's heavy bullet struck Morrison's center mass, driving him backward into the snow with the finality of divine judgment. But even wounded, possibly dying, Morrison raised his gun for one final shot aimed not at Jake, but at Sister Evangeline, his last act of spite against the woman whose courage had started the chain of events that led to his downfall. Jake's second shot took Morrison in the head, ending his threat forever, and bringing a sudden, deafening silence to the clearing. The sudden quiet that followed Morrison's death was more profound than mere absence of sound. Gunpowder smoke drifted across the clearing like incense from some violent prayer, and the metallic scent of blood mixed with the clean smell of snow in a combination that would haunt everyone present for the rest of their lives. Jake stood over Morrison's body, the Winchester still smoking in his hands, feeling strangely empty, despite finally achieving the vengeance he'd sought for 3 years. The moment he'd dreamed about, planned for, lived for, had come and gone in seconds, leaving him wondering why he didn't feel the satisfaction he'd expected. "Mr. Mitchell," Sister Evangeline's voice came from behind him, soft and filled with concern rather than judgment. "Are you all right?" Jake turned to look at her, this woman who had shown him what real courage looked like in the face of absolute evil. Her face was pale and streaked with dirt, her habit torn and stained, but her eyes still held the unshakable faith that had sustained her through torture and terror. "I don't know, sister," he said honestly, lowering the rifle with hands that trembled slightly from adrenaline and reaction. "I thought I'd feel different when it was over. Better somehow. More at peace. Revenge rarely brings the healing we expect," she said gently, moving to stand beside him as they looked down at Morrison's still form. "But justice can begin to heal wounds that revenge only makes deeper and more infected." Major Patterson approached with his expression grave but satisfied, the look of a man who had seen justice done despite the cost in blood and suffering. "Mr. Mitchell, I'll need a full statement about today's events and the circumstances that led to this confrontation. But from what I've observed, you acted in legitimate defense of yourself and Sister Evangeline." Jake nodded, but his attention was focused on Vincent Caldwell, who was being attended by the Army medic with the professional efficiency of someone who had treated many battlefield wounds. Against all reasonable expectations, the man was still breathing, though his survival seemed to hang by the thinnest of threads. "Sister," Vincent whispered as Evangeline knelt beside him in the blood-stained snow, her torn habit spreading around her like dark wings. "I'm sorry. I'm so goddamn sorry for all of it. For the boy I was, for the man I became, for every selfish, cruel thing I ever did to you or anyone else. I forgive you, Vincent," she said simply, taking his cold hand in both of hers with the gentle compassion that had drawn her to religious life in the first place. "And more importantly, God forgives you if you truly repent and ask him with a sincere heart." Vincent's eyes filled with tears that cut tracks through the dirt and blood on his face. "Do you really believe that? After everything I've done, everything I've been part of? After I was willing to sell you to that monster to save my own worthless hide?" "I believe redemption is possible for everyone," she replied with quiet conviction, "even for men who think they're beyond saving." Jake felt those words like a physical blow to his chest. He looked down at Morrison's body, at the blood on his own hands, at the Winchester rifle that had become such a part of him he couldn't remember who he'd been without it. 12 men dead by his hand over 3 years, and now Morrison made 13. How many deaths could a soul bear before it became too heavy to carry? "Sister," he said quietly, his voice barely audible over the wind that had begun to pick up, carrying the promise of more snow. "Do you think there's redemption for a man like me? A killer who spent 3 years living for nothing but revenge?" She looked up at him with those brown eyes that seemed to see straight through to the deepest parts of his soul, past the violence and the hatred to whatever might still be salvageable underneath. "Mr. Mitchell," she said with gentle firmness, "you could have ridden away when you found me tied to that tree. You could have used me as bait to lure Morrison into your trap, then pursued your own revenge without caring what happened to me. But you chose to protect someone else instead of serving yourself. That's not the choice of a killer. That's the choice of a guardian, a protector, a man who still knows the difference between right and wrong." As if to emphasize her words, Major Patterson stepped forward with something metallic glinting in his hand. "Mr. Mitchell, the territorial government has been looking for someone to serve as a federal marshal in this region. Someone with your demonstrated skills and, based on today's evidence, your moral character and commitment to justice. Would you be interested in wearing a badge instead of running from the law?" Jake stared at the silver star the major held out, then looked at Sister Evangeline, whose encouraging smile seemed to light up the gray winter morning like sunshine breaking through storm clouds. For the first time in 3 years, the future looked like something other than an endless cycle of violence and vengeance. "Sister," he asked, his voice carrying a hope he'd thought dead and buried with his family, "what do you think?" "I think," she said, rising gracefully to her feet despite the pain and exhaustion that must have been overwhelming, "that God works in mysterious ways that we seldom understand until much later. And sometimes he places exactly the right person in exactly the right place at exactly the right time to serve his greater purpose." Jake holstered his gun and accepted the badge, feeling its weight as a promise rather than a burden, as a chance for redemption rather than just another tool of violence. "Then I guess it's time to stop running from my past and start building a future worth living." As the Army began the grim work of dealing with the aftermath of the battle, collecting bodies and evidence and testimony, Jake and Sister Evangeline walked together toward the horses that would carry them back to Deadwood and whatever new chapter of their story awaited them there. The morning sun broke through the clouds for the first time in days, casting long shadows across the snow and painting everything with the golden light of new possibilities and second chances. "Sister," Jake said as they prepared to mount up, "I have a feeling our story is just beginning." "I hope you're right, Marshal Mitchell," and she replied, and in her voice was all the warmth and promise of a woman who had discovered that sometimes the most unexpected encounters lead to the most extraordinary destinies. Behind them, the clearing fell silent, except for the wind in the pines and the soft sound of snow beginning to fall again, covering the evidence of violence with nature's gentle benediction and the promise that spring always follows winter, no matter how dark and cold the nights between. The cave that Jake led Sister Evangeline to nestled deep within the Black Hills, like a secret kept by the mountains themselves. Hidden behind a curtain of ice-glazed pine boughs and accessible only through a narrow cleft in the granite face, it had served as his refuge during the long months of hunting Morrison. The entrance was barely wide enough for a horse, but inside the cavern opened into a natural chamber, large enough to shelter both animals and humans from the worst of winter's fury. "How did you ever find this place?" Sister Evangeline asked as Jake helped her dismount from the army horse Major Patterson had provided for their journey. Her voice echoed softly in the stone chamber, and her breath formed clouds in the frigid air despite the protection from wind that the cave offered. "Pure luck the first time," Jake replied, leading both horses deeper into the cavern where a natural shelf provided shelter and the remains of previous fires showed this wasn't his first visit. "I was bleeding from a bullet wound, half frozen, and my horse was about done in. Sometimes desperation leads you to exactly what you need." The irony of his words wasn't lost on either of them. Desperation had brought them together, had led Jake to find her tied to that oak tree, had forced them both to face truths about themselves they'd been avoiding for years. Jake moved with the efficient precision of a man who had lived rough for extended periods, building a fire from dry wood he'd stored in the cave's recesses, arranging their meager supplies, checking the horses for injury or exhaustion. But Sister Evangeline could see the careful way he favored his left side, the slight tremor in his hands that spoke of reactions setting in after the morning's violence. "You're hurt," she said, stepping closer to examine the dark stain spreading across his coat. "That's blood, isn't it?" "Just a graze," Jake said dismissively, but when he tried to shrug out of his heavy coat, he winced and nearly dropped it. "Sit down," Sister Evangeline commanded with the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed in matters of health and healing. "Let me look at that wound properly." Jake started to protest, but something in her expression brooked no argument. He settled himself on a convenient boulder near the fire, allowing her to help him remove his coat and shirt. The bullet had carved a furrow along his ribs, not deep enough to be life-threatening, but certainly painful and still bleeding steadily. "You're fortunate," she said, examining the wound with the practiced eye of someone who had treated many injuries during her years at the convent. "A few inches lower and it would have punctured a lung. A few inches higher and it might have shattered ribs." "Fortune's been in short supply lately," Jake replied, trying to keep his voice light despite the pain that shot through his side with every breath. Sister Evangeline moved to their supplies, returning with a bottle of whiskey Jake carried for medicinal purposes and strips of cloth torn from her damaged habit. "This is going to hurt," she warned, then began cleaning the wound with the kind of gentle efficiency that spoke of considerable experience. Jake gritted his teeth against the burning pain of alcohol on raw flesh, but found himself distracted by her closeness, by the careful concentration on her face as she worked, by the way candlelight from their fire played across her features. Without the severe lines of her wimple, with her brown hair escaping in soft tendrils around her face, she looked younger, more vulnerable, and heartbreakingly beautiful. "Where did you learn to do this?" he asked, as much to distract himself from her proximity as from the pain of her ministrations. "Sister Mary Agnes was a nurse before she took vows," Evangeline replied, wrapping his ribs with careful precision. "She taught several of us basic medical care. The convent serves poor communities where doctors are scarce and expensive. We see everything from ranch injuries to mining accidents to children's fevers." Her hands were gentle but sure as she worked, and Jake found himself studying her face in the firelight. This close, he could see the faint lines around her eyes that spoke of years spent smiling at children, the calluses on her palms from hard work, the small scar on her chin that suggested some childhood adventure. "There," she said finally, stepping back to examine her handiwork. "That should hold until we can get you to a proper doctor." "Thank you," Jake said quietly. "For this, for everything. You could have run when the shooting started, could have hidden and let us settle it among ourselves. Instead, you stayed and helped. That took real courage." "No more courage than you showed," she replied, settling herself on another stone across the fire from him. "You could have used me as bait to draw Morrison into the open, could have sacrificed one stranger to get your revenge. Instead, you chose to protect me. Why?" Jake stared into the flames, watching them dance and flicker as he searched for words to explain something he didn't fully understand himself. I kept thinking about my mother, he said finally. She died when I was 12, but I remember her voice, her lessons about right and wrong. She always said the strongest men were those who protected the innocent, especially women and children. Tell me about her, Evangeline said softly. Bridget O'Brien Mitchell, Jake said, and for the first time in years, his mother's name brought warmth instead of pain. Came from County Cork with nothing but the clothes on her back and a determination to build something better in America. Married my father when she was 17, had me when she was 18, and spent the next 12 years trying to keep us both on the right path. She sounds like a remarkable woman. She was. Fierce as a wildcat when her family was threatened, gentle as spring rain when we needed comfort. She taught me to read using her prayer book, made me memorize psalms and catechism, insisted I learn to see God's hand in everything around us. Jake's voice grew soft with memory. I haven't thought about those lessons in a long time. Haven't wanted to. What changed? Evangeline asked. Jake looked across the fire at her. This woman who had shown him what faith looked like in the face of evil, who had prayed for strength while tied to a tree and forgiven her tormentor while he lay dying in the snow. You did, he said simply. Seeing you there, hearing you pray, watching you stand up to Morrison and Vincent with nothing but courage and conviction. It reminded me that there's still good in the world worth protecting. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the fire crackling between them and the wind howling outside their stone shelter. Finally, Evangeline spoke. Jake, what you said about Morrison killing your family because your wife witnessed his operation, that changes things, doesn't it? This was never just about revenge. It was about stopping a monster who was destroying innocent lives. Maybe, Jake admitted, but I can't pretend my motives were pure. I wanted Morrison to suffer like I suffered. I wanted him to know what it felt like to lose everything that mattered. And now? Now I don't know what I want. Morrison's dead, my family's been avenged, but I don't feel the peace I expected. I feel empty, like I spent 3 years building my whole life around hatred, and now I don't know who I am without it. Evangeline leaned forward, her brown eyes reflecting the firelight. Jake, you're a man who risked his life to save a stranger. A man who chose justice over revenge when it mattered most. A man who accepted responsibility to protect others when he could have walked away. That's who you are. Is it? Jake's voice carried doubt accumulated over years of violence and loss. How many men have I killed, sister? 13, counting Morrison. 13 souls on my conscience. How does a man come back from that? The same way anyone comes back from sin, she said with quiet certainty. Through redemption, forgiveness, and the choice to do better going forward. My faith teaches that no one is beyond salvation if they truly repent and commit to a different path. Jake studied her face in the flickering light, seeing not judgment but compassion, not condemnation but hope. You really believe that, even for someone like me? Especially for someone like you, she replied firmly. Jake, I've seen evil today. Real evil in Morrison's casual cruelty and Vincent's selfish obsession. But I've also seen goodness in your willingness to sacrifice everything for a stranger's safety. The capacity for that kind of goodness doesn't disappear just because it's been buried under pain and anger. They talked through the night as the storm raged outside their shelter, sharing stories of their pasts, their fears, their hopes for a future neither had dared to imagine. Jake spoke of his childhood on a small farm in Missouri, of learning to use guns out of necessity rather than choice, of the gradual transformation from protector to avenger. Evangeline told him about her privileged youth as a governor's daughter, the suffocating expectations of political marriage, the terror of her escape, and the peace she'd found in religious life. Do you regret it? Jake asked as dawn light began to filter through the cave entrance. Giving up your old life, your family's wealth and position? Never, she said without hesitation. I found purpose at the convent, Jake, meaning beyond social obligations and political alliances. I learned that service to others, to God, to something greater than myself, was what my soul needed. And now, after everything that's happened, Evangeline was quiet for a long time, staring into the dying embers of their fire. "I don't know," she admitted finally. "Part of me wants to return to the safety of the convent, to the familiar rhythms of prayer and service. But another part of me," she paused, her cheeks coloring slightly, "another part of me wonders if God might be calling me to a different kind of service." Jake felt his heart skip a beat at her words, but he forced himself to remain still, to let her work through whatever internal struggle she was facing without pressure from him. 3 days later, when the storm had passed and Jake's wound had healed enough for travel, they made their way back to Deadwood through a landscape transformed by snow and ice into something almost magical. The town that had seemed so sordid and dangerous when they'd fled it now looked like a Christmas card, with smoke rising from chimneys and warm light glowing in windows. But the peace was deceptive. News of Morrison's death had spread quickly, and the power vacuum his demise created was already causing problems. His criminal organization hadn't simply vanished with his death. Instead, various lieutenants were fighting among themselves for control, making the streets dangerous for honest citizens. "Marshal Mitchell," Major Patterson said when they reported to the temporary military headquarters he'd established in the town's largest hotel, "I'm afraid Morrison's death has created as many problems as it solved. We've arrested several of his key associates, but others have gone to ground or fled the territory. There's also the matter of his legitimate businesses and properties." "Legitimate?" Jake asked with skepticism. His saloons, mining interests, and freight operations were technically legal, even if they served as fronts for his criminal activities. The territorial court will have to sort out the finances, but in the meantime, we need someone to maintain order while competing factions try to fill the void. Jake looked at the badge pinned to his vest, still unaccustomed to its weight and the authority it represented. "What do you need me to do?" "Be visible. Let people know that federal law enforcement is present and functional. Work with the honest businessmen and townspeople to rebuild legitimate authority." Patterson paused, then added, "And keep an eye on certain individuals who might be tempted to follow Morrison's example." The work was harder than Jake had anticipated. Years as a lone gunfighter had prepared him for direct confrontation, but not for the complex negotiations required to rebuild a community's trust in law and order. He found himself mediating disputes between legitimate businesses and Morrison's former enterprises, tracking down missing women who had been part of the trafficking operation, and slowly building relationships with townspeople who had learned to distrust anyone wearing a badge. Sister Evangeline proved invaluable in this work. Her status as Morrison's intended victim gave her credibility with the women of Deadwood, and her religious training provided skills in counseling and organization that complemented Jake's law enforcement abilities. She worked with the wives of prominent citizens to create a network of support for Morrison's former victims, established a temporary shelter for women with nowhere else to go, and began organizing the kind of community cooperation that was essential for lasting peace. "The ladies have been asking about you," she told Jake one evening as they shared dinner in the hotel restaurant that served as their informal headquarters. "Miss Adams wants to know if you're planning to settle in Deadwood permanently. Mrs. Harrison asked if you're married." Jake nearly choked on his coffee. "They asked you that?" "Small towns are like that," Evangeline said with amusement. "Everyone's personal business becomes everyone else's concern eventually. They're trying to figure out how you fit into their community." "And what did you tell them?" "That you're a man of honor who's dedicated himself to protecting others, and that any woman would be fortunate to earn your respect and affection." Jake felt heat rise in his cheeks. Over the past weeks, working closely with Evangeline, he'd become increasingly aware of his growing feelings for her. But she was still technically a nun, even if her convent had been damaged by the recent violence, and he wasn't sure how to approach the subject of his feelings without disrespecting her religious commitments. "Sister," he said carefully, "what happens when this work is finished? When Deadwood is stable and the territory no longer needs a federal marshal?" "I've been wondering the same thing," she admitted. "Mother Catherine has written to suggest I return to St. Mary's, but—" She paused, seeming to gather her thoughts. "Jake, I need to tell you something. I've been questioning my calling for weeks now, since before Morrison took me. The work here, helping these women, building something positive from the ruins of his organization, it feels like ministry too. Different from convent life, but equally meaningful. Jake's heart began to race, but he kept his voice steady. What are you saying? I'm saying I need to know if there's a place for me in this kind of work, in this kind of life, before I make any decisions about returning to religious life. That evening, Jake found himself walking the snow-covered streets of Deadwood, trying to sort through the tangle of emotions and possibilities that Evangeline's words had opened up. He was a man who had lived by the gun for most of his adult life, who carried the deaths of 13 men on his conscience, who had spent 3 years consumed by hatred and revenge. What did he have to offer a woman like her? But as he walked, he began to notice things he'd missed before. Families gathering around dinner tables visible through lighted windows. Children playing in the snow under their parents' watchful eyes. The kind of ordinary, peaceful life he'd lost when Morrison destroyed his world. Maybe redemption wasn't just about forgiveness for past sins. Maybe it was about the choice to build something better going forward. The next morning, Jake found himself standing outside St. Patrick's Church, the small Catholic chapel that served Deadwood's Irish population. He hadn't attended Mass since his family's death, hadn't spoken to a priest about anything more substantial than the weather, but something drew him to the simple wooden building with its modest cross and welcoming doors. Father O'Malley was tending to the altar when Jake entered, a bear of a man in his 60s with hands scarred from years of manual labor before his ordination. He looked up as Jake's boots echoed on the plank flooring, and his weathered face broke into a gentle smile. "Marshal Mitchell," he said in the lilting accent of County Cork. "I've been expecting you." "Have you?" Jake asked, surprised. "A man doesn't carry the burden you've been carrying without eventually seeking counsel from someone," the priest replied, setting down the candlestick he'd been polishing. "The question is whether you're here for confession, conversation, or just a quiet place to think." Jake considered this, then settled himself in one of the rough wooden pews. "I honestly don't know, Father." "Fair enough," O'Malley said, moving to sit in the pew across the narrow aisle. "Why don't you start by telling me what's weighing on your mind?" So Jake did. He spoke of his family's murder, of the 3 years of revenge that followed, of finding Sister Evangeline and the choices that led to Morrison's death. He talked about the badge he now wore, the responsibilities it represented, and his uncertainty about whether a man with his past could build a meaningful future. "And Sister Evangeline?" Father O'Malley asked when Jake paused. "Where does she fit into this struggle you're having?" "I think I love her," Jake said quietly. "I know I respect her, admire her courage and faith and compassion. But I also know she's dedicated her life to God, and I have no right to ask her to give that up for someone like me." Father O'Malley was quiet for a long time, his eyes focused on the simple wooden cross that dominated the front of the church. "Jake," he said finally, "can I tell you a story?" "Of course. Before I became a priest, I was a soldier. Fought in the war between the states, saw more death and suffering than any man should witness in a lifetime. When it was over, I thought my soul was too stained with blood to ever be clean again. I came out here to the frontier thinking maybe I could lose myself in hard work and harder drinking." The priest's voice carried the weight of old memories, painful recollections that time had softened but not erased. "One night, drunk and feeling sorry for myself, I stumbled into a church much like this one. The priest there, Father Murphy, listened to my confession for 3 hours. When I was finished, he said something I'll never forget. 'God doesn't call the qualified, son. He qualifies the called.'" Jake looked up at the older man. "What does that mean?" "It means that worthiness isn't a prerequisite for service, for redemption, or for love. It's something we grow into through the choices we make going forward." Father O'Malley leaned forward, his eyes earnest. "Jake, you could have walked away from that tree where you found Sister Evangeline. You could have pursued your own revenge and left her to whatever fate Morrison had planned. But you didn't. You chose to protect someone else, to put their welfare above your own desires. That's not the choice of a man beyond redemption. But 13 men are dead by my hand, Father. And how many innocent women did you save by stopping Morrison's operation? How many families were spared the grief you endured? Sometimes God uses broken instruments to accomplish his will, Jake. The question isn't whether you're worthy of redemption. The question is whether you're willing to accept it and live accordingly." They talked for another hour about sin and forgiveness, about the possibility of starting over, about the difference between justice and revenge. When Jake finally left the church, he carried with him a sense of peace he hadn't felt in years. Christmas Eve came to Deadwood with a fresh snowfall that transformed the rough frontier town into something approaching beautiful. The violence and corruption that had dominated the community under Morrison's influence seemed to have lifted like a fog, replaced by the kind of cautious optimism that came with the promise of a better future. Jake stood at the window of his hotel room, watching families make their way to the various churches for Christmas Eve services. The badge on his vest caught the lamplight, and he found himself thinking about the conversation with Father O'Malley about redemption and second chances, and the possibility that even broken men might find their way to grace. A soft knock at his door interrupted his thoughts. "Come in," he called, expecting one of his deputies with news from the evening patrol. Instead, Sister Evangeline entered, and Jake's breath caught at the sight of her. She was no longer wearing her habit, but instead a simple blue dress that complemented her eyes and made her look like any other young woman preparing for the holiday. Her hair, freed from the severe constraints of her wimple, fell in soft waves around her shoulders. "Sister," he said, then stopped, uncertain how to address her now that she no longer looked like a nun. "Just Evangeline," she said softly. "I've been to see Father O'Malley, and then to telegraph Mother Catherine. I've requested release from my temporary vows." Jake stared at her, hardly daring to believe what he was hearing. "Are you certain?" "I've never been more certain of anything in my life," she replied, stepping closer to him. "These past weeks, working with you to rebuild this community, helping Morrison's victims, being part of something larger than myself but different from convent life, this is where God wants me to be. This is my calling now." "Evangeline," Jake said, her name feeling strange and wonderful on his lips, "I need you to know something. I think I love you. I know it's presumptuous, considering everything you have been through, everything I've done, but I can't let you make this decision without knowing how I feel." She moved to stand directly in front of him, close enough that he could smell the faint scent of lavender soap in her hair, could see the silver cross at her throat that she'd never stopped wearing. "Jake," she said, reaching up to touch his cheek with gentle fingers, "I wouldn't be here if I didn't feel the same way. You saved my life, but more than that, you showed me what it means to choose love over fear, protection over self-interest, hope over despair. How could I not love a man like that?" When Jake kissed her, it was with the reverence of a man who had never expected to hold something so precious again. Outside their window, church bells began to ring across Deadwood, calling the faithful to worship, and snow continued to fall on a town that was learning to believe in the possibility of redemption. Spring came early to the Black Hills that year, as if nature herself was eager to wash away the stains of the previous winter and start fresh. Jake and Evangeline were married on Easter Sunday in St. Patrick's Church, with Father O'Malley officiating and what seemed like half of Deadwood in attendance. Evangeline wore her simple blue dress again, the one she'd chosen when she decided to leave religious life behind. But Jake had given her a new silver cross to replace the one she'd worn as a nun. This one bore an inscription: "From darkness to light, from despair to hope, from solitude to love." The ceremony was simple but deeply meaningful, with vows that acknowledged both the pain of their pasts and their commitment to building a better future together. When Father O'Malley pronounced them husband and wife, Jake felt as if a weight he'd carried for years had finally been lifted from his shoulders. "Ladies and gentlemen," the priest announced to the congregation, "Marshall and Mrs. Mitchell." The reception was held in the hotel's main dining room, with the entire community contributing food and music in the kind of genuine celebration that marked not just a wedding but the symbolic rebirth of a town that had found its way back to decency. "So, what's next for you two?" Major Patterson asked as he prepared to depart for his next assignment. "Deadwood's becoming a respectable place again, but there are other towns that could use a marshal with your particular combination of skills and integrity." Jake looked at Evangeline, who nodded with the kind of smile that suggested they'd already discussed this possibility. "We've been talking about that," Jake said. "There are a lot of communities out here that could use help building law and order, establishing schools and churches, creating the kind of institutions that make civilization possible. If the territorial government is interested in that kind of work." "Very interested," Patterson confirmed. The frontier's changing, Marshall. It needs people who understand that true strength comes from protecting others, not dominating them. People who've learned the difference between justice and revenge. As the celebration continued around them, Jake and Evangeline slipped away to the hotel's front porch, where they could look out over the town they'd helped save and the mountains that promised so many possibilities beyond the horizon. Any regrets? Jake asked, taking her hand in his. Only that we can't go back and save your first family too, Evangeline said softly. They deserve the peace and happiness we found. Jake squeezed her hand, filling the wedding ring he'd placed there only hours before. I think they'd approve of what we're building. Mary always said that the best way to honor the dead was to live fully, love deeply, and make the world a little better than we found it. Then that's what we'll do, Evangeline said. Together. Montana, December 1920. The snow was falling again outside the cabin window as Jake finished his story, each flake catching the lamplight like memories made visible. Billy had stopped pretending to work on the saddle hours ago, completely absorbed in his grandfather's tale of love, loss, and redemption. And that's how I met your grandmother, Jake said, his weathered hands wrapped around his coffee cup. We spent the next 41 years together, traveling from town to town, building law and order, establishing schools and churches, raising 6 children, and watching them grow into good people. What happened to all the bad men? Billy asked. Morrison's gang? The other criminals? Most of them were rounded up by the army or other marshals. A few fled to Mexico or California, but Morrison was the heart of the operation. Without him, it fell apart quickly. Jake's expression grew thoughtful. Evil often seems more powerful than it really is, Billy. It makes a lot of noise, causes tremendous pain, but it's ultimately hollow. Good people working together can overcome almost any evil if they're willing to pay the price. Billy looked toward the small schoolhouse visible through the window, its windows glowing warmly in the evening light. Grandmother built that? She did. Taught hundreds of children over the years, white, Native American, Mexican, Chinese, anyone who wanted to learn. She believed education was the greatest gift we could give to the future. Jake rose from his chair with the careful movements of age, walking to a wooden chest in the corner of the cabin. From it, he withdrew a small velvet box that he carried back to his grandson. She wanted you to have this when you were old enough to understand what it means, he said, opening the box to reveal the silver cross Evangeline had worn on the night she left religious life behind. Billy took the cross reverently, feeling its weight and reading the inscription his grandfather had engraved so many years ago. From darkness to light, from despair to hope, from solitude to love. Billy, Jake said seriously, life is going to offer you choices. Some will seem easy, some impossible. The easy ones often lead to regret, and the impossible ones often lead to grace. Your grandmother taught me that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's doing what's right even when you're terrified. Like you did when you found her tied to that tree. Like she did when she forgave the men who hurt her, when she chose love over safety, when she dedicated her life to serving others. Jake's voice grew soft with memory. I thought I was saving her that night, but she was the one who saved me. She showed me that redemption is always possible if we're willing to choose love over hate, forgiveness over revenge, hope over despair. They walked together through the snow to the small cemetery behind the community church, where a simple headstone marked Evangeline's final rest. The inscription read, Sister Evangeline Rose Mitchell, 1854 to 1918, beloved wife, mother, teacher, please don't forget to love. Jake placed fresh pine boughs on the grave, a tradition he'd maintained every week since her death 2 years earlier. Merry Christmas, my dear, he said quietly. Our grandson is growing into a fine young man. You would be so proud. As they walked back toward the cabin, Billy asked, Grandpa, do you think I'll ever find love like that? Jake put his arm around the boy's shoulders, feeling the continuation of generations in that simple gesture. If you're open to it, if you're willing to be the kind of man worthy of a good woman's love, if you remember that the strongest people are those who protect others rather than themselves, then yes, I believe you will. The snow continued to fall as they reached the cabin, covering the world in pristine white that promised new beginnings and fresh possibilities. Inside, the fire crackled warmly, and the future stretched out before them like an unwritten story waiting for the next chapter to begin. "Billy," Jake said as they settled back into their chairs, "remember that everything we've talked about tonight happened because one man chose to protect a stranger instead of pursuing his own revenge, and one woman chose to trust in redemption instead of giving in to despair. Sometimes the most extraordinary destinies begin with the most ordinary choice to do the right thing." Outside, the wind carried the sound of church bells across the valley, calling the faithful to Christmas Eve services, and somewhere in that sound was the echo of all the choices, all the all the faith that had brought them to this moment of peace and possibility. The old gunslinger and his grandson sat together in the warm glow of lamplight, surrounded by the accumulated wisdom of a life lived fully, loved deeply, and dedicated to making the world a little better than they found it. And in the silence between them was the promise that every ending is also a beginning, that every story of redemption creates the possibility for new stories of hope, and that love, once kindled, continues to burn across generations like an eternal flame passed from heart to heart.